So today what we're going to do is we're going to talk about vaccination with respect to herd immunity in particular, but also kind of bring in choices of individuals and why folks choose to or to not vaccinate, or reasons beyond choice as well. Before we do that though, I want to take a few minutes to describe this final project for the semester, which is this 20-point group video on giving a mini lecture or a short lecture on one topic of your choosing. I'm not going to decide what the groups are. I'm just going to put out there they should be sizes of 3 to 4 people together. What I want to do for it is that you and your group will pick a topic that you find interesting. It should be one that you can at least cover the basics of in a few minutes. Okay, these should be about 5 to 7 minutes in total, with about 2 to 3 minutes at the end reserved for questions for each group as well. I think we're going to have somewhere around 6 to 8 total, so we should be able to cover these in the 2 final classes of the semester. So next week Wednesday and next week Friday. The particulars for this assignment are there are 3 pieces that are going to be due over the next week. So one is you need to just submit me simply a topic that I approve of. That's a 2-point assignment. Yay. Have that done by Monday. If you can have it done even sooner than that, that's better, because what that allows is for you to spend Monday actually looking for information on your topic. What was that?
What was the word? Sorry.
Pick a topic.
Oh.
Pick a topic with your group. The second one is come up with 2 questions for your topic. And these can be basically the equivalent of review questions. I'll use these to put together a study guide, but also as a way to figure out what questions I'm going to put on the final, because some of the questions from the final will come from this set of lectures. For the final, I'll be using these as multiple choice and fill-in-the-blank type questions. And I'll probably take about 2 from each of the lectures. And then the last part is the actual presentation, and that has to be ready to go by Wednesday. I don't care how you set it up. It can be on VoiceThread, or it can just be a video that you have running if you want to. I'm not requiring anybody to stand up in front of the classroom and actually speak during it, because I'm forcing you to do that Thursday for lab anyway. So this one is a bit more informal. Below what you'll see are just the expectations for what I have for you to include, and then there's a rubric below this. Topics last year ran anything from particular types of diseases that we hadn't talked about to using antibodies as cancer treatment, extremophiles, which we haven't really touched on either this semester. The topic does not have to be something we've touched on, and actually I'd rather it be on something that we haven't talked about that also interests you. That's about all the comments that I have for it right now, unless there are any questions. Okay. All right, so come prepped, ready to talk on Monday, because believe it or not, this is the last lecture that I have this semester. So, all right. Cancel that out. Close that out. All right, so before we talk more about vaccines, all right, so this is from last year. This was like December. And here's my daughter Reed explaining the flu vaccine.
So, Reed, why did we go get our flu shots this year?
Because if we were going to be around little kids, then we wouldn't want to give them the flu.
And how does the flu shot help you to not get the flu?
It
Okay, so that second part was tad bit prompted, but no kidding, she came up with that on her own. So, from the mouth of a 6-year-old, that's what the flu vaccine is for. Okay, not necessarily all that hard to figure out. The flu wants you, your body doesn't want it. So, all right. What I wanted to do was to get started today then was to have you guys talk with a partner or a couple of partners and basically recap the homework a little bit. Come up with a list between you and your partner of reasons why people choose or choose not to vaccinate, and then other reasons why people may not be able to vaccinate. And let's take about 2 minutes and then we'll work on generating a list together. Go ahead. Why do individuals choose not to vaccinate? Okay, good start. Others? Okay. So, health. So individuals who are immunocompromised. Particularly, which vaccines would this be of concern for? The attenuated or the live, okay? And so the MMR vaccine, measles, mumps, rubella, is an attenuated vaccine. You would not give this to a child who is immunocompromised. Okay? Other reasons. That actually is a really good one. The cost of it, right? Do you have an example in mind, Carson? You may not, and that's fine. I mean, some vaccines are relatively cheap, right? For those of us who have health care, we oftentimes can get flu, some of the other general ones through a healthcare provider. But if you don't have health care, if you don't have Medicare or Medicaid, some of these you might be unable to pay for. And some are just darn expensive. HPV, for example, I think is about $150 to $200 per dose if you're paying out of pocket for it. So it's not necessarily a cheap one. Other reasons. Yeah. I'm going to put here personal beliefs as kind of an add-on to this, because I think that's where you're kind of going with this. Absolutely, absolutely. What kind of beliefs do people have other than religious? That's one. Not necessary. That's a big one. I was waiting for somebody to finally say it. Any others? Taylor. That's a good one. This isn't necessarily somebody who is immunocompromised, but some vaccines do have particular material in them that can cause an allergic reaction. So the majority, at least the flu vaccine that most of us get, is raised in chicken eggs. So if you're allergic to eggs, you should not have that one. They have alternatives to it, but you need to let your healthcare provider know about that beforehand. That's a really good one. I'll put in one more. Not natural, which I don't know what's more natural than a virus, but that's just my opinion. Okay. Somebody might argue the chemicals that are used occasionally for preservation or used to inactivate certain viruses as another argument. It's a pretty good list. And obviously some of these are ones that are not necessarily a choice, but are rather just a reason why somebody cannot be vaccinated. Immunocompromised, allergies would be ones, cost would be another one, religious beliefs would be another one as well. I don't necessarily want to get into the autism debate today. I'd be more than happy to talk about it if anybody wants to, but that's not necessarily what I want to spend the time talking about today. I want you to think about a couple of things here, though. How many of you are on the nursing track? Most everybody, okay? You will face people in your careers that choose not to vaccinate. So one of the things to think about is, how do you talk to that individual? How do you tell somebody that you should do this, if that's what you believe? And I'm not trying to impose my personal beliefs on anyone. But if you think strongly that individuals should be vaccinated, how do you argue that to someone? And this has actually been a really big issue for a number of years now, and there have been a number of studies looking into this. How do you talk to a parent who has a child and they're afraid of vaccinating that child? What could you do? So what could you try to do to persuade?
If you're a nurse, especially, and you have kids, I mean, every person's scared to have their infant injected with everything.
Yeah, in human nature, we're more likely to be persuaded by somebody who empathizes rather than somebody who says, you must do this, right? Or you're an idiot not to do this. Absolutely.
They're not being underestimated.
Yeah, absolutely. So empathy. What else could we use? Taylor.
Offer resources like studies saying that like vaccines are safe and like long-term effects of using vaccines.
Good. Absolutely. Others? Those are actually two studies, or those are two strategies that have been looked at. A third is show parents gruesome pictures of children that have been infected with the diseases that these vaccines are meant to protect against. And the fourth is hear from parents who chose not to vaccinate their children and then had their child die or succumb to one of these illnesses. There was a study done about 5 years ago looking at those four methods, talking to parents who were, I think, adamantly anti-vaccine. And guess which one actually worked? One of those, actually, none of them worked. None of those strategies ended up having any effect whatsoever. So some would argue then that is it worth the time? Is it worth the energy in trying to persuade somebody who is adamantly against vaccination? I liken this to a political conversation a little bit, so bear with me for a minute here. We have Democrats, we have Republicans, and we have a big group in the middle that can be persuaded in any given year based on the candidate. We have independents. There's arguments that those are the individuals that we should be trying to persuade, not those who are definitely against vaccination and not those who are pro-vaccination. You're not going to persuade them, you're not going to change their opinions. But it's the group in the middle who may not know whether it's necessary to do, who may not really have strong convictions one way or another, that some are arguing now that's the population we should try to be going after in increasing vaccination rates. Okay? And maybe one of these strategies works with those. Empathy would probably be the one that I would most naturally go to. All right. So that was that's just something to constantly, I think is an important thing to think about, is how do you interact with patients in trying to persuade them for or against vaccination, however you choose. Some people, there are other reasons up here as well, actually, that we didn't talk about. Anybody want to take a guess as to why HPV was shunned as a vaccine by a large population of individuals? How is HPV passed from one person to the next? sexual transmission if we're talking about the forms that cause cervical cancer. Some believed that it would promote sexual promiscuity among 13 to 19-year-old females. Okay? And actually there's no evidence to that whatsoever. So that would be another reason why parents might choose not to have their children vaccinated as well. Okay, what I wanted to do then is kind of shift this focus a little bit towards the idea of herd immunity. So before we do that, what we're going to do is we're going to take about 13 minutes here, because that's how long this takes. We're going to watch this TED Talk. This is one that I really think is, it's about 5 years old now. Oh, 3 years. But I think this one does a really good job of kind of explaining the issue that we face right now with herd immunity.
Life is a story about risks. The ones that we actually calculate and weigh out, and the other ones that we just accept as part of a life well lived. We could die playing table games, skiing, running, jogging, dance party, which in my mind is probably the best way to go. It could be as simple as jumping on your bike or getting in a car. Averaged across the population, we have a 1 in 112 chance of dying in a motor vehicle incident. Yet most of us accept those odds for the convenience of traveling from point A to point B. And while this is a story about risk, it's not about dying, it's about living. See, for me, the choice is easy. I view the vaccine the same way I view a car seat. In the event of one of those incidents, my child is safe over there. After the measles outbreak, he's probably safe if he's been vaccinated. And yes, this is my son at his 2-month checkup just after he got his vaccines. And yes, I'm that weird parent that takes pictures of their kids after they get vaccinated. On the right, his immunization record, which as of 2 weeks ago at his 15-month checkup, he is up to date, not delayed, no exemptions. But this is bolder, and I realize that the choice for many of you isn't as easy as it was for me. If by chance you turn to the internet or the GOP debate, then you know just how confusing these messages might be. And the reality is, we're parents, we're just trying to make the best decision for our children. But how did we get here? Now, vaccination has a really long history. But if we just dial it back 60 years ago to an auditorium like this one, Dr. Francis revealed the results of the Salk polio vaccine trial. It was one of the largest medical experiments in history, consisting of 1.8 million children. Safe, effective, and clear. Immediately thereafter, the March of Dimes launched a national ad campaign, and some of the most notable celebrities of that era showed up to be the face of vaccination. Fast forward a few decades, we have a slightly different situation. On the top is Andrew Wakefield, whose fraudulent paper trying to link the MMR vaccine to an autism-like disorder has since been retracted. He was a fraud. The whole story was fabricated, and he was part of a host of an amazing number of ethical issues. Since then, over 100 studies have definitively shown that there is no link between autism and vaccines. Yet celebrities like Jenny McCarthy and Jim Carrey continue to push this dangerous agenda. It usually starts with a story, and then another story about a friend or a neighbor. But let me remind you that the plural of anecdote is not data. And perhaps more troubling than that is that a lot of the resources that are designed to incite fear about vaccinations cherry-pick data sets out of context to tell a story that isn't even there. So I present this joke slide from Redditor Jason P55, which it turns out if you cherry-pick the rise in organic food sales over time, and you lay that on a chart with the rise in person is still highly contagious. It's one of the most contagious viral diseases? No. On the top, we see the number of people that one infected person would likely infect the population. On the left, you see Ebola, where one infected person is only likely to infect 2 other people on average in a susceptible population. On the far right, measles, 18. One person with measles may infect up to 18 people in that susceptible population. And the reason that it's so contagious is that it's an airborne disease. It can actually persist in the airspace for up to 2 hours after an infected person has coughed or sneezed. So you can imagine, with your tongue planted firmly in your cheek, why someone might say, "Our thoughts are also with the measles-ravaged country, America. I hope we are screening them before they come to Africa." But as I said, this is a story about risk. So let's actually compare the risks of the disease versus the vaccine. Let's take this front row right here, 20 people. Let's give them measles. Sorry. With that, we would expect 2 people to have ear infection, 2 people to have diarrhea, and 1 person to have pneumonia, which I might add is one of the deadliest complications of measles. Now, if we swap that out for 20 people with the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine, we'd expect to have just over 3 people with a fever and 1 with a mild rash. Getting back to the disease, if we scale that population out to 1,000 people, we'd expect to also find 1 person with encephalitis, or swelling of the brain tissues, which can have severe permanent damage, and 1 to 2 people would die. However, we have to scale the population out to 1 million vaccinations to see 1 severe reaction. Now, perhaps you're willing to roll the dice, perhaps you're willing to take that chance. And the problem is, while this is a personal decision, it affects other people. Vaccinations work based on herd immunity. When the population is not vaccinated, disease spreads rapidly through a community. When only part of a community is vaccinated, that disease still spreads very easily. However, when most of a population is vaccinated, we can contain that disease. In the case of measles, that number is 95%. 95% of the population would need to be vaccinated to contain measles. So let's see how we stack up. Remember that hot, dry forest I mentioned? This is a sample of a few schools in
All right. So there's a lot in there. I just want to try to take a little bit of time for us to unpackage some of it. And like I said, majority of what I want us to focus our time on here is the idea of herd immunity, and also she brings up another term called herd threshold as well. So what I wanted to do is give you guys a couple of minutes to try and synthesize this. What I want you to do is take out a piece of paper for yourself. You don't need to rip it out of your notebook. This is for you, or you can type it. Just write down, what is herd immunity? Describe it. What is its purpose? And who is it intended for? What is it? What is herd immunity? Megan.
Like the more people that have the vaccine, the less people that will get infected from the disease.
Okay, so the more that have a vaccine towards this particular pathogen, in this case a virus most likely, the less likely it is, or finish up what you were saying, sorry, or finish the last part again.
Like the more that have the vaccine, the less likely it is to get the disease or whatever.
Right, so the less likely it is that others will get the disease. And why is that? So why is it less likely that others are going to become ill, or the population as a whole, the likelihood is less when there's a higher percentage of people vaccinated?
Other than the ability for the virus to attach to the host cell, because
Yeah.
you've already seen, the host has already seen the virus.
Yeah, so really it's, and let's remember again what the purpose of vaccination is. What does vaccination do? Or at least what does it do, what is the design of it?
Introduce your body to the
To introduce your body to the virus so that your body can do what? Fight it off, produce antibodies, create an immune response to it. Okay? So really what we have here, and the idea of herd immunity, and all of those were great ways to describe it. The idea here is that at a certain level of individuals being vaccinated, each individual ends up serving as kind of like a physical barrier to prevent the spread of the virus. So in the bottom example here, we've got a population that may be somewhere around 90% of the individuals are vaccinated against whatever this disease is. The red people are the infected people. Well, the virus can go and infect all of these other people that have been vaccinated, but they're not going to experience signs and symptoms of the illness because their immune system is primed and ready to basically kill that intruding pathogen. Okay? And the goal then is to, like you saw in the image there, the last image of the elephant surrounding the young, the goal is to protect those who are immunocompromised, particularly the elderly, the young, those who can't receive vaccines. That's the design, or at least that's the theory behind herd immunity. If we reach a certain threshold, we can at least stop the spread to different individuals. Now, the threshold refers to a percentage, and these have largely been, I think that these percentages, if I'm not mistaken, are based on some mathematical algorithms, which we will not do here, because I know how much everybody loves math. But the idea is, for certain diseases, it's much higher than others. Measles has a really high threshold. It has to be about 90% of the population has to be vaccinated against measles to prevent it from causing a widespread disease within a community. Why is it so high for measles? Grace? It's airborne. And what did she say? For every one person, 18 on average. Measles from one person who's infected can be passed to 18 others on average. So the threshold for that's really high. For something like Ebola or HIV, where it was more, I think it was like the 2 to 4 range for those, threshold could probably be lower. Could probably be about 70 or 60%, and that might actually be good enough to reduce the spread of the illness. The goal with vaccines is to have the most effective vaccine as possible. And to be honest, none of the vaccines that I know of are 100% effective. Most vaccines may be in the 60, 70, 80, 90% range effectiveness. The measles vaccine, the other reason why the threshold is so high, only works in about 70% of individuals. In other words, in 70% of individuals, their body develops an immune response and produces antibodies to protect against measles. And the remaining 30%, the immune response isn't strong enough. And so even if they were exposed to measles, they would probably get an infection from it. So the threshold depends on the ease of spread, but it also depends on how good or how effective is the vaccine at triggering a long-term or helping to create those memory cells. There are cases, at least there have been arguments that we should allow some vaccines where the threshold is really low. Or I'm sorry, not where the threshold is very low, but the efficiency of the vaccine is really low. For example, Ebola and HIV. There are HIV vaccines that have been tested, not on a human population just yet, but or not on a civilian population. Actually, it has been tested, I think, with the Army. But they're not really all that effective. They're only about 30% effective. At least that's what the data suggests. And with something like HIV, where you're infected for the remainder of your life if you become infected with HIV, you could argue that, yeah, 30% is better than nothing. Emma, go ahead.
This is a random, but
Please.
like, using the Army, how would you test the vaccine?
How would you test the HIV vaccine? Yeah, that's a great question. So the ones that they're using are DNA vaccines, which is a group that we didn't talk about on Wednesday, but was one I had you guys look at. And the idea of DNA vaccines is you would inject a piece of the DNA from encoding like one of the proteins from HIV to and allow it to replicate or allow that protein to be expressed in your cells so that you trigger T cytotoxic, T helper, and B cell response from that. Okay. So the way that vaccines are tested, and Kathleen hit on this a little bit with polio, you have two groups. One group gets the vaccine, the other group gets a placebo. You allow them to live their lives, and then you follow up every so often to see, okay, how many of them now have the illness? And that's how you can determine how effective it is.
So does it see if they get the illness from the vaccine?
Good question. Okay, go ahead.
Exposed to HIV.
Yeah, so with HIV, the vaccines that they're using, the telltale sign of HIV infection is one, you producing the virus itself. And then two, HIV integrates its DNA into our chromosomes, so you would be able to detect that. But the idea of the vaccine itself is that basically DNA vaccines, here, if this is our cell, here's a nucleus. What you would do is put into these cells or inject into them a plasmid that has one single protein on it. This plasmid will get lost over time. After about 2 or 3 rounds of replication, it gets degraded and broken apart because it doesn't have the factors or the DNA sequence that it needs so that every time this cell divides, others divide, it divides along with them. So this would be lost after about 3 weeks or so. All right. But what you would look for are some of those other telltale signs. This has been done with HPV as well. So the HPV vaccine, a large study was done, I think it had something around 8,000 females. Because at the time it was only used for females. Now it's approved for both males and females. And for those cases, well, what kind of outcome would you look for with HPV? What would be the sign that somebody has been infected maybe with HPV? What does HPV cause? cervical cancers. So what you would look for, and how do we check for cervical cancers? Pap smears, exactly. So what has been done with HPV is these two populations, one group gets 3 rounds of the vaccine, the other gets nothing. You give them the same general information. Protect yourself during sexual intercourse, and other sex ed stuff from high school that I've completely blanked out because it was a horrifying time in my life, right? But you would give them the same general information, and then you would send them out, allow them to live their lives, but ask that every year or so they come back for a pap smear. Now, the thing with cervical cancers is we can detect pre-cervical lesions or abnormal growth. So with the pap smear and the way that it's done in different models, they will grade it on a 1 to 4 scale, and the increased number means that it's a more abnormal cellular growth, and then you have cervical cancer, which is kind of the worst, obviously, of all of these. Well, they actually tested for, with pap smears, are they a 0, are they a 1, 2, 3, or 4, or is this cervical cancer? And what you find is there's a huge difference between the two populations.
So if they
Go ahead.
had the vaccination, then is it less?
Much, much less. We're talking about like a reduction of about 99.7% in the incidence of cervical cancer, or those precancerous lesions.
How do you take into consideration like the factors between the different populations?
So like behavior and stuff like that, you can't. That's the really tough part with some of these vaccine trials, is you can't tell people how to live their lives. You can inform them, right? You can give them the same, you try your best to control for things like age of the individual, socioeconomic status, race, gender, if this were a general vaccine, education level, if you're talking about adults. You would try to account for as much of that as possible to show that the two groups are as identical as you can be. But obviously you cannot control human behavior, right? So one of the things that human studies requires is really large populations to be able to make sure that the effects aren't because of one population doing something that the other isn't. Now, those are all really good questions. And vaccine trials are one, not cheap, and two, they take quite a while to run. I mean, the HPV one, I actually think we are just now at the point where we're starting to determine the effects on cervical cancer. Before it was precancerous lesions. And now we're also starting to get evidence on other types of cancers caused by HPV as well, not only in females, but in males too.
And I think like, I could be wrong with the vaccine, but I want to say it's like HPV, so they're determining whether if you actually have to get 3.
Yes, so now it's down to 2. It is down to 2, which cuts out, $200 of the $600 that it originally cost. They've also upgraded it, and what I mean by that is now it protects against 9 different strains of HPV instead of the 4 that the original Gardasil protected against. So it includes 4 of what we would call high-risk HPV strains, ones that contribute to the vast majority of cervical cancers, and then 5 others that are either low risk or cause genital warts but don't cause cervical cancer.
Will they ever send someone back to get an updated vaccine?
Yes.
Like now,
Not necessarily with HPV. I mean, with HPV, maybe. The thing with HPV is the timing is important here, because the argument at least has been you want to do it before somebody is sexually active. If they are in a monogamous relationship, and they have had clean pap smears for most of their life, there probably is no need to do it.
Okay.
But you want to try to time it before sexual.
Okay, so you would send someone back now, like, because if they had the one that was.
I don't think
fighting
so.
off 4 versus 9.
But we do send people back for other types of vaccines.
Mm-hmm.
So you guys, and as a general population, are all of the age that I'm guessing most of you have gotten the chickenpox vaccine at some point in your life. what we are finding is that individuals who have gotten the chickenpox vaccine get shingles much, much earlier in their life than do people who got chickenpox naturally, like myself. So, what is being argued is that those individuals need to be going and getting shingles vaccines earlier on. And actually, there's a new form of the shingles vaccine that just came out. For individuals who got the old version, they're recommended to get the new one because it's supposed to be more protective and last and have a longer long-term memory effect. Yeah. And of course, boosters too would be another example.